I was just watching Snake Plisskenus reply to hythloday. Actually, a couple of replies and back and forths. Um, so one thing came up was hythloday referred to me and my this. Well, one, I was happy that he understands even somewhat my claim that you, hythloday, understand my claim as to my approach here. But you ended up calling it immoral. This fact that I'm perfectly happy just to be exposed to your ideas. To the point of understanding them, and you talked about that as somewhat immoral because there it implies, which is true, and I accept that there's some purpose to which of my own purpose that I'm not necessarily trying to bring you to some universal truth that I've seen. And I think you misunderstand this. I mean, one thing that offends me is this concept that there's a lack of structure to my approach, because you have to understand. I believe that the amount of structure that's appropriate depends a bit on the situation and the purpose. The thing to me is I state all these the purposes that I'm following and the purpose and I state the criterion. I was referring to my system last time we talked, relativistic skepticism, which I've named as a convenience so that we could identify uh, what my epistemology, to the point of assuming people have absorbed this, but they haven't. You weren't familiar with it. It has come up a lot while we discuss, but I present it, I suppose, as my epistemology. And while I think that there's a lot to argue for this epistemology, my main interest is just in describing it. When you describe things that way, people don't get it because they're habituated to having someone trying to tell them the absolute truth, and here's the absolute truth. And so they're actually more accustomed to being called an idiot for not accepting it than they are to just having it presented and being told, take what you will. I'm not really invested in you taking these ideas and these tools. Now, it has occurred to me that at 46, that I think it's time for me to enter a new stage. It's not that what I believe is changing. It's more a reflection of the mortality of mankind. So, for example, I just took a couple weeks to write my philosophy down, my basic core philosophy. And I have about 100 pages single spaced of A5 size of writing, and it's far from complete. It doesn't even touch onto my politics or various other ideas, but it has brought certain things to light, some of which are that there really are things that people, I think, need to learn or know, and they're often things that I have actually sort of subtly assumed that people kind of get the gist of. I'll give you an example. So, for example, any given statement can be broken down into component statements, component ideas, component concepts, and then those concepts can further be broken down. And much like reducing matter into atoms and so on, at the bottom you find that there is not so much reduction, but a transformation. That one kind of fundamental particle can actually change into some other fundamental particle or small set of particles. When you have energy equals mc squared, does we generally take that to mean that, or I do, that everything is energy. Why? Well, because there's so much mass. Energy obviously isn't made out of mass, but it's the other way around. But when you take that down to what we would call fundamental, though they might not truly be fundamental in the classical sense, when you take them down to these elementary particles, they do transfer back and forth. And, you can put it in one form or the other. And which is it really? Well, it's behaving one way at a particular point. But you have a long way to go before you get to where the principle of reduction breaks down. Okay. And people don't realize this. I had assumed people could realize that if you take a statement and you think about it and you think about it, you will get an idea of how that breaks down. You won't necessarily be correct, but then if you break down those pieces, you will get more and more information about how everything works together. And in that process, you will find contradictions. Now, it's my belief that people don't really know what they think. Okay, and this is a problem they have with relativism. People seem to think that since every person, since the truth is relative to your point of view, that means that you could just decide whatever you decide to believe is true is true. No, no, you can get it wrong. What's true from your point of view, right? You can get it wrong. What's true from your point of view. I don't believe in universals, but there are certain things that you can use to reason back up. So, for example, I mean, we're all here in the same gravitational field. And if somebody wants to think that heavier objects fall quicker than lighter objects, that isn't true. They are just mistaken from their own point of view. Now, how can you tell somebody their point of view? You don't have to, right? You can measure these sorts of things. Not everything is immeasurable, and I would argue that nothing ultimately is immeasurable. So I don't think it's that I lack an appreciation for a structured approach. In fact, the whole point of this tool I'm making, a lot of the things I do, the structure I tried to put on our first Stickum conversation that went so awry. I believe a lot in structure, but I don't believe in over-imposing structure. I don't believe in a purity of absolute structure, right? And yet, I'm quite fond of going to the whiteboard and proving my point. And I can do that as a relativist because we share a lot of common frames of reference. Our point, our reference frames are not entirely independent. We are all humans. We have very similar DNA, so on and so forth, right? So, and I have often called to go ahead and do such proofs because I program computers in teams, and sometimes you have to prove to other people that their idea won't work. And when I do that, I usually present 3 or 4 or however many ideas I could come up with, all of which will work with various trade-offs, because there are some that are incoherent, internally inconsistent. They're not valid. The reasoning is not valid. And by reducing and breaking things down, you will see the invalid reasoning if you look. Okay, so my main purpose in terms of this medium, in terms of reason, other than just expressing myself, which is probably 80% of it, but my purpose in how I would influence others, if at all, would be that I don't think people know how they think. I want people to look and actually break down their own thoughts to see how they think. They don't actually know. Now, Snake Plisskenist was saying that people react in their best self-interest, but he qualified that with as their best ape self-interest, because it's not necessarily their actual best interest, not even assuming we're using that person's criteria. And I would say really people react in a way that's to reject anything that's emotionally difficult, right? And so often, because of their emotional makeup, the truth, what would be best for them to understand, figure out, and do, is emotionally difficult, and so they reject it. Now, you were saying that we should start by agreeing on principles, and I would say that that's impossible. And this follows from the fact that all principles can be broken down into other principles, and at the bottom, principles can be transformed into each other. The principle that you need 2 free variables to describe 2-dimensional space is almost tautological, because that's just what a 2-dimensional space is. But it's not without relevance. because it means you can translate a Cartesian coordinate system into uh, a polar coordinate system, into a hyperbolic coordinate system. And yet some of the statements that you would make in one of those systems or another are not possible to make in the other system. For example, I think I mentioned when we were talking, uh, I got this idea that I'd be interested to see what the equation is for a sine wave in a polar coordinate system. And it turns out it has an infinite number of terms. There is no simple formula for a sine wave, not even using trigonometric functions, which themselves are maybe a little bit, you know, complex. Maybe those shouldn't be considered atomic units. But in a polar coordinate system, in our kind of mathematics, there is no way to express a sine wave. You cannot isolate r on one side and theta on the other. Both sides of the equation have r and theta. So it does matter which coordinate system you take. And yet, there's no absolute reason that one coordinate system is better than the other. It depends on the situation. And this is where pragmatism comes in. You seem to think that there's some sort of assumption as to what is pragmatic. But what's pragmatic depends on your goals. So your criteria of studying things. So pragmatism really is not some sort of opposite of an idealism. Because, for example, if your goal is to let's say, create a more just and honest society, then it's pragmatic to teach ideals of being honest, of not stealing. It is pragmatic to go into reasons to behave that way, right? So really, pragmatism is just a way of saying, let's get back to things we can agree on, like, less more income per capita makes for a more secure society, less thieving, less starving. Now, will some people reject those principles? Yes, and they can do that. And I'm perfectly happy with that because I believe things like that break down to who you're going to have to actually combat. Who do you actually have to combat? The fact that there is such a thing as a Nazi morality, I don't obsess over the fact that it's immoral. It violates my morality. I don't say, therefore, it's not a morality. I simply say somebody with that morality is necessarily an enemy of mine. And that there is not going to be arguments that convince that morality to behave in accord with my morality. There are truth statements within my morality that it cannot be stated in their system, and vice versa. And I'm quite clear which system I prefer, right? So I only think that that's an insufficient approach if it turns out that that most people support that kind of a value system, and I don't find that to be the case. As a matter of fact, most people that profess to believe in this so-called system of right and wrong that this hypothetical Nazi would advocate actually don't know their own beliefs. Or I'm arguing with libertarians recently, and they always are talking about why should the government, it's a big thug, violence to take my money with taxes. And they're using a piece of paper that has the government's name right on it. Currency doesn't print itself, and it's not free to print it. It's not free to regulate it. Right now, I think there's plenty of problems with the way that system works. But it's a real thing, this currency. And they want to use it for free. Now, so do they really believe that? No, they just don't understand there's a contradiction. They're the ones asking to use something for free. They're refusing to accept the agreement that was made that allows them to use that currency. Another thing that's come up in that context is, it's like most people in my country have come here through immigration. So the people here, their ancestors have taken an oath of allegiance, or more generally what you call an oath of citizenship, agreeing to our laws, agreeing to the Constitution and uphold the laws of the land, which grant the taking of taxes. And then their children are born, and it's like, well, and they've said this to me, well, I never agreed with that. I never agreed to that. If you inherit a house that still has a mortgage on it, do you think you're absolved of having to pay that mortgage off? If you buy property, or if your grandparents bought property and they did not buy the mineral rights, do you suddenly, when you inherit, there you do have the mineral rights? So certainly there is a libertarian philosophy, but most people we're talking to that claim to be libertarian, they're not consistent to that philosophy. It's cafeteria philosophy. They take the part that says I'm mad at the government for taking my money, when in reality they're actually in my same position, which is complaining about how that money's used, complaining about if too much is taken. Maybe they have ways that it wouldn't have to be taken. Maybe the government could make all the revenue it needs through some other sort of structure. In other words, they could take part in the debate of how the system works. Instead, they pretend that the whole system is immoral and they never agreed to it. And somehow the force used against them to make them pay their taxes, if it comes to that, is different from the force used against them if they steal something from somebody and the police come and retrieve the property. Okay, now I know this confuses people, and I really, just to be honest, I think it's because people aren't very sophisticated. Um, and I don't intend to compromise, because I do live by my own set of principles that I prefer, and in many ways I'm more idealist than pragmatic, except for that my ideals themselves are pragmatic. All right, so. So anyway, so I think that let's see what else I had written down here besides the structure thing. Oh yeah, Snake Plissken made a joke, obviously, since he was downing a bottle of Everclear. He said it was that he was loath to defend me because I'm an alcoholic, and this is just typical. You know, I more or less stopped drinking, which I say more or less because I did have those 3 beers one day last weekend when we were visiting my wife's family. For me, it was the first time visiting them up in Montreal. And I just find it ironic that really there's more pressure from things like that, after you stop something than when you continue. It's just funny. Okay, so just to be clear, that was always a lame excuse. And I know he was just joking about it, but he's not the only one that's come up with. The same thing, like Modern Mystic made a negative video a few months ago. I guess it must have been, like 6 months ago now. Well, no. No, it was since I was in Maine, a couple months ago. And he was basically trying to dismiss myself and Thou Art That as, we're addled, I drink too much, he's on the wacky tobacco, and so on. And is he going to come back now to the things I'm saying now when I'm not drinking and correct that? It's like, oh, now you're right. No, it's just an excuse. It has nothing to do with the argument. And it bears, if it was really a principle, for example, an ideal of their philosophy that they were working from, then when that fact changed, their thinking would change. But it won't. It'll just get scribbled in with another color. Monkey thinking kind of stuff. Um, principles of pragmatism I wrote down. Yeah, you really, just like any reasoning, you have to state what the principles are you're using. But the problem is they're not absolute. They're for the sake of argument. They can always be broken down further, and you don't have to agree with them 100%, and you will never understand them 100%. Okay, and so when you say that we should start with principles, that's impossible, as I said earlier, because we're starting with ideas that always can be broken down, right? So what is necessary is to have some agreements of where we're working, but those can't be entirely fixed because they're all subject to question. That's the meaning of skepticism, the philosophy of reflection, that you can always reflect more on things. right? So we're breaking concepts down, and it's confusing to people because human beings have been around for a while now, and the parents, the grandparents, the great grandparents, and so on and so forth, the predecessors, have done a lot of this breaking down, and they have taught us principles, and we think those are our starting points. And that would be great if those principles weren't a bit screwed up. Thou shalt not kill. All of society seems to think it agrees with that, and yet we go fight wars. It's like, oh, well, that's different. And some people try to get all technical. It's like, well, it's thou shalt not murder if you're talking about the biblical thing. And what does murder mean? Well, murder is killing that isn't justified. So that's a totally meaningless definition. This distinction of murder, you know, it, um, it begs the question in the classical sense of begging the question. So we need to rethink those principles, like the principle that it's wrong to kill, and we need to break that down into a sub principle. And the end result, and the reason we do that is not because we don't already think that, what we call as murder is wrong, but it's kind of find out what we mean, right? And then with those principles, we can build arguments back up. And I'm very into that process. And I think you and I should have another hangout where we add as much structure as you can bear, hythloday, and see where we go from there.